Good evening. I'm Patrick Lewis, the Director of Collections and Research at the Pilsen Historical Society. I'm so glad that you joined us for tonight's presentation, Beyond Slavery's Shadow, Free People of Color in the South. Warren Eugene Milteer Jr. is an assistant professor of history at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. He received his PhD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in 2014. His publications include two academic books, Beyond Slavery's Shadow and North Carolina's Free People of Color, 1715 to 1885, out from LSU in 2020. He independently published Harford County, North Carolina's Free People of Color and Their Descendants, 2016, as well as articles in the Journal of Social History and the North Carolina Historical Review. Milteer was the recipient of the Historical Society of North Carolina's R.D.W. Connor Award in 2014 and 2016 for the best journal article in the North Carolina Historical Review. I'll return to moderate questions after the presentation as time permits. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Warren E. Milteer Jr.
Thank you for the kind introduction. So I'm looking forward to this presentation and sharing with you a little bit of information about my book, Beyond Slavery's Shadow, Free People of Color in the South. And so what I want to do today is provide you with a little sample of the book, tell you a little bit about what I'm trying to do as far as the main points that I'm trying to share with people, give you a little bit of just background information about free people of color. And then I also want to talk about the overall structure of the book and give you a sampling of the book's contents. And so I really appreciate everybody who's come out tonight. I know that in the current moment, you could be doing something else with your time. And so it really means a lot to me. So what I want to do first is to just read a couple of paragraphs from the book's introduction, and then I will build off of that to tell you a little bit more about free people of color in the South. And so in the introduction, I begin with the story of a free man of color named Amariah Reed. And so this is a little bit about him. Over the course of nearly 80 years, Amariah Reed lived out a life that was typical of many men of his generation in the South. Born a subject of the British Crown around 1762 in Nansemond County, Virginia, by age 16, Reed had enlisted in the effort to overthrow British power in Virginia and several other colonies. After participating in various skirmishes against British forces, Reed was present for the surrender of Lord Cornwallis at Yorktown. Following the war, Reed returned to Nansemond County, settling down on an 80-acre tract with his growing family by the early 1800s. Reed's 80 acres eventually became the inheritance of his children, who would continue to prosper from the foundations laid by their father. Yet Amariah Reed also stood apart as a man who was born free in a time when most other people of color in the future U.S. South were born enslaved. Unlike the majority of people termed quote unquote colored in his community, Reed could and did hold title to personal and real property. He could work for himself, provide for his family, and keep his wages without interference from a white master. In the courts of Virginia, he could sue and be sued. As a free person of color, however, he was also subjected to an increasing number of restrictions and forms of legal discrimination. Since the time of his birth, Virginia law prevented him from enjoying some of the civil rights possessed by his white male neighbors, including the right to vote and the ability to hold public office. When Reed decided to spend the rest of his life with Betsy Skeeter, Virginia law prohibited them from marrying because he was quote unquote colored and she was white. By the time of his death, the state had passed laws that prohibited Reed from traveling freely between Virginia and other localities, required him to obtain a license in order to own a gun, and demanded that he register with county officials in order to receive documents proving his free status. Reed was wedged in the precarious position of being both free and yet a person of color. So let me share my screen really quick so that you can see a few of the slides that I've prepared for this presentation. So here are some of the documents that I used to tell Reed's story. This is part of his Revolutionary War pension from Virginia, and you can see he's described as a free man of color and from Nansemond County, Virginia. And then this is a pretty interesting document, I think, where Reed is listed in the 1830 US Census, and you see it has his name, Amariah of Reed, and that he has a white wife who would be Betsy Skeeter that I described a little bit earlier. And so to go forward with Reed's story is important for a couple of reasons. One, because I think Reed's story at least gives us a sampling of some of the important points that I want to make in the book. And so one of the major issues that you'll see throughout my discussion today is this push and pull between the freedom that free people of color enjoyed. So the things that distinguished people like Amariah Reed from the enslaved population, the ability to hold property, own a business, earn a wage and keep your wage without interference from somebody else. Those things are being pushed back against over time by political forces and also forces within local communities. So the political forces from the colonial period through the Civil War period, which I cover in the book, are gradually trying to strip away the rights and privileges of free people of color. And you also have a group of supporters of these politicians who passed these laws, and I describe them as a white supremacist faction, then also a pro-slavery faction that sometimes come together to push legislation, push for legislation against the rights of free persons of color. So again, this push and pull is very central to the book. And I go into greater detail, of course, describing exactly how that works. Also, the story of Amariah Reed helps to explain why I became interested in the topic of free people of color. And so Amariah Reed is one of many ancestors that I have who were free persons of color in this pre-Civil War period. And so upon learning about my ancestors who were free people of color many, many years ago, started to do research on them in archives, the computer, etc. And that drove my interest and led me to write both this book, Beyond Slavery's Shadow, as well as two additional books. So one of them is Hertford County, North Carolina's Free People of Color and Their Descendants, which I independently published, and then North Carolina's Free People of Color, 1715 to 1885, which was published by LSU Press in 2020. And so this project, Beyond Slavery's Shadow, is expanding on those findings that I found in those two earlier projects and offering an argument that is a little bit more broad about the situation of free people of color in the South. Now I want to move on and provide a little bit of background information about free people of color and where they stood in Southern society. So when we think about free people of color, often I think most people think about one or a couple of places. Probably the primary place is Louisiana and the Creoles of color in Louisiana. And sometimes I think also people will associate the population of free people of color with Charleston, South Carolina. Those tend to be places that come up in a lot of historical conversation as well as conversations amongst the general public. But as you can see in this chart, where I have the populations of free people of color throughout the different parts of the South, that the majority of free people of color are actually situated in the upper South in states like Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, Delaware, and then you see Louisiana coming in fifth. I know that a lot of people in the audience are probably in Kentucky or have ties to Kentucky, and you see that Kentucky is actually has a sizable population of free people of color by 1860. Um, the total number of free people of color in 1860 is around 250,000, a little bit more than that, and they make up the majority of free people of color in the United States. Want to also just show you this chart, which gives you just a little bit of a better visual um, of the population and how the population breaks down in the South. So you can see from that chart, if you just add the populations of Maryland, which is in that lighter blue color, and Virginia, which is in the lighter green color, that makes up over 50% of the South's population of free people of color with just those two states. And then you throw in North Carolina and Delaware, you're really talking about a significant portion of the free people of color. The lower South has very small population of free people of color throughout the period that I discuss in my book. The next chart on this particular slide just shows you what the population of free people of color looks like at a more local view. So you can see the cities or counties that had the largest populations of free people of color in the South. So the chart looks somewhat similar to what you saw before, where Maryland, Delaware, Virginia are very significant when it comes to places with large populations of free people of color. So you've got places like Baltimore County, which would have included the city of Baltimore that had the largest population. Orleans Parish, which is where the majority of free people of color in Louisiana lived. That would have included the city of New Orleans. Washington, D.C. Now, during this time period in around 1860, Washington, D.C. is actually broken up into multiple places. So Georgetown is separate from Washington, D.C. If we threw Georgetown in with Washington, D.C., there would be slightly more people in the District of Columbia, free people of color in the District of Columbia, than there were in Orleans Parish. And some people may be interested in knowing where do places in Kentucky fit within this larger picture. So Louisville, Jefferson County had the largest population of free people of color in 1860 for the state of Kentucky. And so Louisville is around number 25. So talking about a couple of thousand free people of color, which is a significant population. And then after Louisville and Jefferson County, free people of color, the next largest populations of free people of color are in places that you would probably expect: Fayette County, and also Franklin County come after that. But we're talking about 600 free people of color in Fayette County. So significantly less than these counties you see on this chart, and also significantly less or fewer people living there than what you would have seen in Louisville and Jefferson County. Now I want to move on and discuss a little bit about the book's organization and some of the contents of the different chapters, try to provide you with a synopsis of what's going on throughout this book. So the book starts with the chapter about free people of color in the colonial period. And in that chapter, what I try to do is to explain the origins of free people of color, like where do these people come from, who are they? So there I'm talking about um, the processes of becoming free. So some people are born free, some people were enslaved and became free through the process of manumission, which was a legal process that made enslaved people free. I also talk about the diversity of free people of color. So most people assume that free people of color are persons of African descent, but you could also be classified as a free person of color and be of Native American descent without having African descent. Of course, there are many people who are a mix of both, along with having significant European ancestry. So that's one thing that I introduce in chapter 1. And also, I begin to discuss the contrasting experiences of free people of color. And that's a theme that I keep up throughout the book. And in doing that, what I'm trying to do is show the differences between, say, free people of color who are poor and those who are more well-to-do. And one of the examples of the poor free people of color is Isaac Cromwell. And so you can see in this image on the screen that Isaac Cromwell was a servant and that he was in a relationship with a woman named Anne Green, who was living as his, they were living together as husband and wife, and they had run away together. And so this is a runaway ad where they had left their master in Frederick County, Maryland, and tried to seek out freedom. There's actually a similar ad that was issued in a different paper at a slightly different time where they tried to run away again. So you can imagine that these people had a tough life, and it was very challenging. And ultimately, there's a system that is created to keep them in a certain position in their society. Now, in contrast to the experience of Cromwell, there are individuals like William Chavis. So William Chavis was a free man of color who lived in Granville County, North Carolina in the middle of the 1700s. And Chavis was in no way a person of the servant class. He actually was an enslaver. So he held at least a dozen people in bondage at one time. He also was a property holder as far as real estate property, and owned probably around 1,000 acres of land at one time. In addition to that, he had a tavern, he was literate. So his life contrasted significantly from the larger group of free people of color who were poor, who were stuck in servitude. Also in this chapter, you won't see this represented in the slides, but it's something that I definitely highlight in the beginning of the book is I place significance on other types of hierarchy that existed in colonial America. And one that I really push is the difference between the situation for free men of color versus free women of color. So if you get a chance to read the book, you'll see that as well. In the book's second chapter, I move into the period of the American Revolution and the broader revolutionary moment that's taking place in the late 1700s. And I focus on the growing numbers of free people of color that are popping up across the South, as well as in the North, during this late 1700s period. And so what is going on in the late 1700s is you have religious movements that are pushing for emancipation of enslaved people, and also more politically driven movements where people are reimagining what it means to be free. They're putting more emphasis on the idea of freedom. And in doing that, they're providing opportunities for enslaved people to become free persons. And that is done both by and people who are enslaving people deciding that they're no longer going to do that, but also people of color going out of their own way to obtain freedom. So some of them are suing for freedom in the courts. Some of them are saving money and buying themselves, buying family members, buying friends, as this moment arises. And part of what's going on is that the Quakers and other individuals are lobbying state legislatures to either end slavery, which of course doesn't happen in the South, or to at least make it easier for people who want to emancipate enslaved individuals to do so. Because what had happened is in the colonial period, um, there had been regulations put on manumission that basically required manumit people to leave the colony upon obtaining their freedom. Some places even restricted the ability of uh, slaveholders to actually emancipate people if they wanted to. So that's kind of the background of what's going on and how things are changing during that time. And so the story of Phyllis is one story that I discuss in the book to reflect some of the major issues that are taking place in this late 1700s moment. And so Phyllis was a person of color who was being illegally enslaved in Delaware during the late 1700s, and she sues for her freedom in a local court. And she argues that she should be free because her grandmother was a woman from the East Indies, which is what you see in the image, and that would include modern day India. Um, and she's saying that that ancestor was a free woman, and therefore she should be a free woman too, because that's where her mother's mother was free, so therefore she should be free. That's how freedom is determined in this particular context. And she has a woman who knew her family testify on her behalf, and she is able to obtain her freedom. Also, in this second chapter of the book on the late 1700s, I discuss what's happening to free people of color as far as opportunities and also challenges. And so Benjamin Banneker is an individual who reflects both of those um, ideas. Banneker, of course, is best known as the author of an almanac. And so you see an image of the almanac here on the slide. Benjamin Banneker also was a person who spoke out for the rights of free people of color and enslaved people in the late 1700s. So he wrote on the behalf of his peoples. And one of the items that I discuss in the book is a letter that he wrote to Thomas Jefferson. And basically, in his letter, he's calling out the hypocrisy of the founding generation and saying that, you know, they're creating this nation and talking about freedom, but then hold other people in bondage. So when you think about the idea that people aren't challenging what's going on at the time, you see through somebody like Banneker that indeed there are challenges being made and people are pointing out, hey, this isn't right. Slavery is not right. And something needs to change. Now, in my third chapter, I discuss the backlash to this push for freedom that takes place in the 1700s. So the third chapter focuses approximately on the years 1800 to 1830. And in that chapter, I cover the numerous legislation that came about following the push for manumission in the South. And so states across the region from Virginia to Kentucky to Louisiana are passing rules restricting the movements of free people of color. They're restricting their access to the ballot. So Maryland is one state that actually allowed free people of color to vote in its original constitution. But by the beginning of the 19th century, that right has been stripped away for free men of color specifically. Um, and then you see a lot of other laws that you might think of when you're thinking about discrimination against free people of color. Some of them having to do with um, selling alcohol, the ability of free people of color to defend themselves against attacks from white people. All of those things are being regulated in this time, and many of these regulations will continue to pop up throughout the pre-Civil War 19th century. In addition to a push for restrictions on free people of color, we also see the rise of the colonization movement. And the idea behind the colonization movement, for at least many of its supporters, was to take free people of color and push them outside of the United States. And early on, it was debated exactly where free people of color would be sent. Some people wanted to send them to the Caribbean. Some people wanted to send free people of color to Africa. And many free people of color eventually do head to Africa, specifically Liberia. And two of those individuals that leave the United States for Liberia are Joseph Jenkins Roberts and Jane Waring Roberts. And they were both originally from Virginia. Now, Joseph Jenkins Roberts seems to have gone to Liberia um, to seek better opportunity, because ultimately he will become the president of Liberia. So that was something that wouldn't have been possible for him here in the United States. But he also is going to Liberia for business opportunities. He establishes with a partner a trade relationship between the United States and Africa. Now, moving on from this backlash, I also show in the fourth chapter of the book that free people of color, despite what's going on politically, try to create opportunities for themselves and their families. And they do this through a variety of different ways. One of the major ways that they do this is by creating their own institutions. And so one of the major institutions that pops up in many parts of the South in this early 1800s period are churches for people of color. So in certain parts of the South, people of color, white people are going to church together. But what is happening increasingly is that people of color are not able to operate within those churches as the equals of white people. And so some of them decide to leave the white churches and go to create their own congregations. And so one of these congregations is Bethel Church in Baltimore, Maryland. Also, free people of color are establishing educational institutions for their people. So free people of color are creating schools, and they're also teaching within those schools. And one of the individuals who played an important role in early education for free people of color in Baltimore was Daniel Coker. And Coker was a minister as well as a teacher in the area. Additionally, we see that free people of color continue to thrive despite some of the restrictions that are being placed on them by creating their own businesses. And so here you see an advertisement for Amelia Shadd's Oyster Hotel, which was located in Wilmington, Delaware. And in her advertisement, she lists all of the different foods and preparations of oysters that she offers at her hotel. And she's encouraging people to come and visit her hotel and explaining how great everything is that she has in her establishment. And there are other examples that I talk about in the book of similar individuals, men and women who have businesses, whether they're restaurants, shipping businesses. There are free people of color who are doctors in this time period. So all kinds of different trades. And I also explore the situation of poor free people of color and the types of work that they had to do. Following the fourth chapter and the fifth chapter of the book, I go into an exploration of the Nat Turner Rebellion of 1831 and the different laws that are developed following the rebellion dealing with free people of color. So historians for a long time have cited the 1831 Nat Turner Rebellion in Southampton County, Virginia, as an important moment of change for free people of color, for enslaved people, and for the South as a whole. And so what I do is I try to show what happened to free people of color during and immediately after the rebellion. And so that's where the story of Willis Augustus Hodges comes in, because Hodges lives in Virginia. He lives a few counties away from Southampton County, and he experiences the aftermath of the rebellion in his community. Some free people of color in his community are harassed by local officials and I guess people you could describe as ruffians in his community, and they are causing a lot of problems for the free people of color, and he goes into detail about that, and also describes some other examples as well. Now, I think what's important about my analysis of the Turner Rebellion is that I show how it affects free people of color immediately after, but I also explain that some of the laws that I talk about in that chapter that are further discriminating against free people of color are not necessarily new ideas, and that the moment of the Nat Turner Rebellion gives pro-slavery and white supremacist politicians an opportunity they wouldn't have in normal times to pass legislation that could negatively affect free people of color and take away some of their rights, because they can in that moment show, hey, I'm being tough on this particular issue. I'm trying to protect you and doing whatever is necessary to protect the population. But indeed, they're just implementing ideas that they've had for a long time and couldn't get out there before. Following the rebellion, of course, free people of color are dealing with a variety of different challenges, legal challenges, as well as challenges against their ability to operate freely. And one of the individuals that I discuss is Leonard Grimes. Leonard Grimes was a free person of color from the Northern Virginia area. And I explained that he was involved in an escaped attempt involving some enslaved people. So he was trying to help guide them to the North and got caught and ended up spending time in Virginia State Penitentiary. He later left Virginia and settled in the North and became a minister and continued his anti-slavery work there. But Grimes and the story of other people shows that free people of color who were trying to make the South a better, more equitable place indeed faced some challenges during this period from, say, 1831 to about the eve of the Civil War. Now, following the pattern that I've set up throughout the book, I follow the chapter about the Turner Rebellion, the aftermath, and the legal discrimination that comes about following that rebellion, with a chapter about what free people of color are able to do despite that situation in the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s. And so one of the individuals that I discuss in that section is Daniel Payne. And so Payne is originally from South Carolina, but actually spends a lot of time in Maryland, where he is a minister in the AME Church. He is a teacher and helping to educate the people of that community. And also he's involved with other important organizations for free people of color, including a burial organization in this time period that I'm discussing, free people of color have to figure out on their own where are they going to bury their dead. They have to figure out how to support such institutions by raising money and creating things for themselves. And so Payne is an example of one individual who successfully helps to create and support important institutions for free people of color. Washington Spradling is another key individual that I focus on in the book's the book's 6th chapter. And so Spradling was a free person of color, originally born into slavery. He was emancipated at an early age and operated a business in Louisville, Kentucky. And he was able to obtain quite a bit of money through his work. And he used that money to support his community and help to improve the lives of many people. He claimed to have helped several dozen free people of color he helped several dozen enslaved people obtain their freedom through manumission. So they would borrow money from Spradling and then pay for their freedom, and then they were supposed to pay him back. And so he played a key role in expanding the population of free people of color in Louisville, along with his contributions to the business community. Another example that I go into in this particular chapter is the example of John Patterson Sampson. And so he's part of my section on higher education for free people of color. John Patterson Sampson actually attended college during the 1850s. His family was originally from Wilmington, North Carolina, but he had to go to the North, of course, to obtain his education because such an opportunity was not available for him in the South. But nevertheless, because he came from a relatively successful family, he was able to use his family's finances to get himself out of the South and obtain something that wasn't readily available to most Americans at this time. Now, the book's final chapter explores the experiences of free people of color during the Civil War. And in that chapter, I divide my attention between the situation of free people of color who are in parts of the South that are held by rebel forces and those parts of the South that are loyal to the United States, or that the United States is able to take over during the course of the war. And in those sections, I describe the experiences of numerous individuals, poorer people, more well-to-do people, and they all make different decisions based on what they think is right for them in a very tough situation. One of the individuals that I highlight is Moses Hammond, who was from Frederick County, Maryland. And Moses joined the U.S. Army and later worked in a hospital and contributed to the cause of the United States in that way. Another key figure that I discuss is Mary Smith Peak. Mary Smith Peak was originally from Virginia, the Tidewater, Hampton Roads area, and following the U.S. takeover of her region of Virginia, which was around Fort Monroe, she became a teacher for the recently freed people who had escaped slavery. And so she was teaching them some of the more basic skills that they would need, like how to write their letters, how to read basic words. Now, my book's conclusion focuses on what happens to free people of color after the Civil War. I look at immediately what happens, and also have a little bit of a discussion about the larger impacts of the story of free people of color on our own time and how their legacy can help us understand some things about our current moment. Two of the figures that I talk about in that immediate post-Civil War period were Oscar Dunn and PBS Pinchback. Dunn and Pinchback both served as lieutenant governors in Louisiana and for a time served as acting governors of Louisiana. And so they are some of the earliest people of color to serve in such positions in US history. And they're, of course, able to use the skills and opportunities that they gained as free people of color in the pre-war period to obtain position in the post-war period. So I'm going to stop there and take questions. If you're interested in the book, UNC Press has copies, and you can go to uncpress.org, and there is a code for 40% discount, which is 01DAH40. So I look forward to your questions. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for that really fantastic presentation, and especially for the discount code. That is greatly appreciated. We encourage everybody to get onto the UNC Press website. We've got a ton of really good questions in here already, and I encourage folks to keep plugging them in here as well. Our first question takes us back to the earliest part of your presentation and asking about Amariah Reed and his white wife. Does that notation suggest that marriage is illegal or just exceptional? What do we know about that context there?
Yeah, so it's a weird situation in that 1830s with that 1830 census, because for some reason the census taker decided to note different households where there were free men of color living in relationships with white women. And why the census taker decided to do that, we really don't know. Of course, these types of relationships exist across the region, but they weren't legal. In at least in Virginia, they were not legal. And so you have a situation where free people of color are participating in activities that aren't sanctioned by the law, but apparently are at least to some degree accepted by the community. I don't know if the community would be encouraging such relationships, or I mean, I guess it depends on who you're talking to, but generally speaking, no, they're probably not encouraging it, but it's happening, and they kind of accept that this is what's going on. There are cases, of course, in the South where free people of color and white people are prosecuted for being engaged in such relationships. But even after prosecution, I mean, what are they supposed to do? They have children in many instances. And I think local officials are much more interested in making sure those children stay off the poor rolls than they are in breaking up those relationships.
I think it's really fascinating from a research perspective to show that evidence. And so I'm really appreciative that you put that screenshot up there, right? But to think about the different ways that we can capture information about these relationships, and if they appear in court versus they appear in the census, what does that suggest? And it documents that relationship, but if you only have it in that one instance, it raises all those questions about what does this actually mean?
Right. Yeah, and I think that what the census does do is that it explains to us that although marriage was not legal in the situation, that people on the ground accepted these relationships as common law marriages. Mm-hmm. And they're looking at them as such, even though there's no legal sanction for them.
I will also point out that as a very spoiled Civil War and Reconstruction historian, I think that the 1850 and 60 census are the gold standard. I think that might be the most useful tidbit I've ever seen pulled out of a pre-1850 census.
Yeah, yeah, they're definitely hard to work with in that pre-1850 period.
All right, moving on. Really great question. You mentioned the divisions among free people of color, gender, wealth, literacy, all of those sorts of things. Why do you think it's so important that you call attention to this great diversity among the free people of color in the South?
Well, I mean, I think there are a couple of reasons. One, because it tells us a lot about the different experiences of free people of color, but it also helps to explain some of the diverse reactions to what is going on in the South. I think I see this in particular with the Civil War moment, where we see the laws that are at their most extreme, but also people are facing great challenges. And so you have poor free people of color who are having one experience, especially within the states that are in rebellion, but also wealthy free people of color who are trying to maintain businesses and keep business relationships despite what's going on. And some of these free people of color are also slaveholders, right? And so they're making their wealth on the backs of enslaved people, and they have a lot to lose too if slavery is ended in the South. And so if we don't pay attention to these say class differences between free people of color, none of this makes any sense. Like, why are enslaved people or why are free people of color enslaving other people? Why are they supporting certain movements during the Civil War? But if you pay attention to class differences, then you get a sense of what's going on. And then if you think about gender, I mean, that's really key. I mean, it's in the laws in certain cases. So especially in the colonial period, the experiences of free women of color are significantly different than free men of color, especially if they're poor or members of the servant class. There are laws that say this is what happens to free women of color who, say, have children out of wedlock. Those laws don't apply to the free men of color in the same way, if they apply at all. And so I think that's key. And it's something that you see throughout inheritance laws and how they apply, voting restrictions and how they apply. So yeah, free men of color can vote in states like Maryland and North Carolina and Tennessee at certain periods, but that's not an option for free women of color. And so when we're thinking about the laws and how they're impacting free men of color by taking away their rights to vote, I don't want to overemphasize and say, hey, they're taking away the rights of free people of color, because indeed they're taking away those rights from a specific segment of that population. And it says something about how gender relations work in the early 19th century South.
That's really fantastic. We've got a really good question here about what do we know about the prevalence of individuals or families attempting to pass as white? I really appreciated the numbers that you showed for different regions of the South. Do we know how common or uncommon that is? Is that overblown in historical memory?
So no, I don't think it's overblown. If anything, probably people don't realize how common it was. Yeah, I mean, that's something that's happening throughout this story, is that there are, at least in the case of free people of color who eventually being categorized as white. And there are free people of color who, visually, I think people today would think of them as white people, but they weren't. They were considered free people of color in their own time period. And I know, through all of the research that I've done, conversations that I've had, that I've talked to descendants of free people of color who today are white. Yeah, there are many of them out there. I don't know what the percentages are, but I imagine it's much higher than what a lot of people would suspect. I think there's some communities of free people of color that basically all the descendants of those communities today are white people.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. It's a tough historical question when the goal is to be hidden, right? right? Is to erase that past.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. But what is interesting, of course, is in our current moment, there are some people who want to know about their ancestors, regardless of, how they were categorized, because it tells them something about themselves and where they came from. And so yeah, there are people who take that very serious and want to dig into this topic. And yeah.
Fascinating. I had a great question about going back to the numbers that you showed at the beginning of the presentation about Washington, D.C., which seems to, for its tiny little postage stamp sizes, this huge free Black population. What's going on in D.C.?
Yeah, so I think part of what's going on in DC is because DC politically is, split between the influences of people from the North and people from the South, that you have a lot of support within DC compared to other parts of the South for manumission and emancipation. And as we get closer to the Civil War period, restrictions on slavery in Washington, D.C. become tougher. And so I think it creates an environment that free people of color find at least somewhat welcoming compared to other parts of the region. But also, if you look at what's going on in surrounding areas in Maryland, um, parts of Northern Virginia, Delaware, all of that region, Philadelphia, of course, is not that far away from Washington, D.C. So influences from those areas are also playing a role, I think, in what's going on in that particular part of the country.
We had another regional question that came in a little bit later, but I think it fits in right here, asking about, why don't more free people of color leave the South, and talking about Philadelphia, thinking about the large, Black population of New York. There are these extant, colonial era free Black populations that are there in states that, will emancipate gradually in the early republic. But what's keeping the folks that you study in the South?
Yeah, so I think it's probably a few things. Number one, just family connections, people who own property. It's not easy to just give up your property and go leave and go somewhere else where you've never been before. It's a strange place. Of course, some people do that, and many of the free people of color who move to the Midwest, even a large percentage of the population of free people of color that are living in the Northeast are people who originally from the South. But yeah, I think family connections, property. Also, that there's an economic factor to this as well. The South is the booming area of the country during significant parts of my study. And so there are free people of color who are looking for financial opportunities, and they're willing to put up with some of this other stuff in order to make it and get rich. And I think that's especially the case when you're looking at the relatively small population of free people of color living in the deep South, in places like Mississippi and Alabama, South Carolina, some parts of Louisiana. There are opportunities there for them when it comes to business that they would just have a hard time finding in other parts of the country. And actually, the wealthiest free people of color on average live in the deep South, even though they're a small population. They're centralized in that region. Yeah,
That's
so
really fascinating.
there are large populations of free people of color in Maryland and Virginia, Delaware, but those people are on average much poorer than the free people of color who live in Mississippi. And that, by the 1860, we're talking about a few hundred people who live there, but still on average, they're doing much better.
We had a question about manumission, and sort of when that's timed in the life of a person who becomes free. Does that tend to come sort of at the end of their life? Is there a timing there that relates to sort of their perhaps diminishing returns to the enslaver? What's the sort of timing there, or does it have nothing to do with them at all? And what is of most benefit to the enslaver?
Right. Yeah. I mean, it varies across the board. So there are individuals, especially in that late 1700s period, who are trying to emancipate people who are old and worn out, basically, from their standpoint, because they don't want to care for those individuals. And the states get on top of that issue pretty quick. And so they require posting bonds, and they require statements basically saying that, hey, you're going to emancipate this person. You need to promise us that this person's not going to end up on the poor rolls. Because they see this scheme developing. But as far as the general population of free people of color who are being emancipated, the ages of the people vary from small children and babies all the way up. Of course, you've got certain free people of color who obtain their freedom because they're tradespeople. They're able to save money and buy their freedom. Those free people of color who are children are often, emancipated by family members. And so that plays a role in how they become free. And of course, with children, the incentive to freeing children is that they are cheaper than on average a grown adult who can work and labor and have major impacts for the economic benefits of those who are enslaving them.
I wanted to close out tonight and sort of bring this around to present day and reflection. You've published a number of books here recently when issues surrounding race have become of great national importance, and of course in our city as well, in Louisville. What does your research really speak to our contemporary conversations around race and politics?
Yeah, well, I think there are a few things going on and things that we can connect to the experiences of free people of color. One, I think that the experiences of free people of color make us rethink or challenge us to think about what does freedom really mean in the context of the United States and its long history. Because these people that I'm writing about are legally free, yet even with them being legally free, you can see all of these opportunities to strip away different rights from them, whether it's voting rights, which of course is something that is still being discussed today, their rights to movement. So if you're thinking about rights to movement, the situation of free people of color, I think, is really informative when we're talking about immigration and how people regulate the movement of people across national boundaries, state boundaries. I think that the situation of free people of color is really informative to that topic as well. We're thinking about the exploitation of workers in certain situations. I think that, again, we can learn a lot from the story of free people of color, because part of the reason that free people of color, we were talking about earlier, like, how is it that these free people of color are able to avoid some of these discriminatory laws, even though they're on the book saying, hey, you can't do this, you can't do that? How are they able to get around that? And part of what's going on, especially by the time we get to the 1850s, is that there are certain business people who are looking for cheap labor, and ultimately they are more interested in getting the cheap labor provided by free people of color than they are in enforcing discriminatory laws. So they're encouraging people to cross state boundaries, even though it's illegal, to do work in their state, because that's what's financially beneficial to them. And so, of course, we see those kind of conflicts still coming up in our discussions about race and politics today. And so, yeah, some things that seem new aren't very new at all. They just change a little bit. Who's targeted, it might be a little bit different.
Well, I think that's the perfect closing case for everybody to go to uncpress.org and use that discount code and pick themselves up a copy of the book. Warren Milteer, thank you so much for being with us tonight. This was a really fantastic lecture.
Thank you so much. I appreciate everybody coming out, and I hope you all get a chance to take a look at the book.
All right. Thanks a lot. Good night, everybody.